What they found in the abandoned car. It was a late afternoon in the middle of October when the wind carried that uneasy chill that always seems to come before nightfall. The highway was unusually quiet, with only the occasional truck roaring past and leaving behind the echo of its engine. Just off a stretch of road in rural Ohio, a highway patrol officer noticed something that didn't belong. Parked at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by weeds and brush, was an old beat-up sedan. Its driver's side door was closed, but the angle of the car seemed wrong, as if it had rolled and come to a stop instead of being deliberately parked. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? At first glance, it looked like just another abandoned vehicle. That stretch of highway had seen plenty of them cars left behind after accidents, stolen vehicles dumped and forgotten, or simply broken down machines waiting for a tow. But there was something unsettling about this one. The officer pulled his cruiser over and walked toward the car, gravel crunching beneath his boots. The sun was sinking low, and long shadows stretched across the asphalt, bleeding into the dark outline of the woods. The sedan's paint was peeling, its windows streaked with grime. He immediately noticed that the license plates had been removed. That alone was strange enough, but as he leaned closer, he realized the windshield had a faint spiderweb crack running from one corner, like it had been struck hard. Dust covered the hood, but there were smudges on the driver's side window, smudges that looked too much like handprints. The officer tugged on the driver's side handle. It was unlocked. The smell that rushed out made him recoil. A pungent, metallic odor hung in the air, mixed with something sweet and rotten. Inside, the upholstery was torn and stained, but that wasn't what froze him in place. On the passenger seat sat a small leather-bound notebook, its edges curled from moisture. On the floor beneath the steering wheel was a single shoe, scuffed and mud-caked, and in the back seat, pressed against the door, was a dark, crusted stain that could only be blood. He called it in immediately, requesting backup. Within the hour, state police and investigators arrived, their headlights cutting through the growing darkness. They taped off the area and began their work, pulling on gloves, photographing every detail, carefully dusting for prints. But the deeper they looked, the stranger the situation became. There was no wallet, no ID, nothing that could identify who had driven the car. The glove compartment had been emptied except for a broken pen and a crumpled fast food receipt. But the date on that receipt was weeks old. The odometer showed the car hadn't been driven far since then. The trunk was the real horror. When officers forced it open, their flashlights revealed a large black trash bag stuffed against the far corner. It was tied with electrical cord, the plastic stretched and torn in places. When they cut it open, the stench was unbearable. Inside was clothing, women's clothing, damp and stained, a jacket, a torn blouse, and jeans with the knees ripped open. Folded between the fabric was something else, a set of photographs. Each picture was of a different location. Abandoned farmhouses, empty playgrounds, remote dirt roads swallowed by trees. In every photo, there was a date scrawled on the back. The notebook from the front seat offered more clues, but also more terror. Its pages were filled with shaky handwriting, short entries that read like fragments of thought. Some described watching people from afar. She walked alone again. Same route, same time. Others were even darker. The woods hide everything. They don't hear the screaming in there. And one line in particular made the investigators pause. The car is only the beginning. Neighbors from the area were questioned. A farmer down the road mentioned he had seen the car parked there a few nights before, but he hadn't paid much attention. Another person recalled hearing strange noises near the woods late at night, something between a scream and a shout, cut off suddenly. For weeks, the police scoured the forest that bordered the highway. They found disturbed soil in several places, shallow pits half covered with leaves, but nothing inside them. It was as if whoever had used that car had moved quickly, changing spots, hiding something they didn't want discovered. The photographs were traced, and investigators visited each location. At two of them, they found more evidence, shreds of fabric, small bone fragments, and at one site, a rusted shovel leaning against a collapsed shed. Despite all this, no one ever came forward to claim the car. No missing person report matched the clothing found in the trunk. The shoe from the driver's side was never paired with an owner. The notebook, with its disturbing messages, offered no name, no signature, just page after page of unsettling thoughts that felt less like a journal and more like a record of stalking. The car was eventually towed to a secured lot, but even there, officers who had to process it described feeling uneasy. Some swore the smell of decay lingered no matter how much evidence had been removed. Others said the notebook pages seemed to shift, like words were darker each time they looked, though that was likely exhaustion playing trick. What makes the case so disturbing is not only what was found inside the abandoned car, but what was never explained. Who wrote in that notebook? Whose clothing was hidden in the trash bag? Why those specific locations, photographed and dated? To this day, locals driving past that stretch of highway say they feel a chill when they see the turnout where the sedan was discovered. Some claim that on foggy nights, headlights catch a shadow moving near the trees, as if someone is still standing there watching. Others say it's just the imagination running wild after hearing the story. But one fact remains. The car appeared without warning, filled with evidence of something unspeakable, and then vanished into storage. No owner, no missing person tied to it, no answers. Only questions that continue to haunt anyone who has read the case file. And the notebook's final entry still echoes like a threat, written in uneven letters at the bottom of the last page. They won't find the rest. The case that made detectives quit? In a quiet part of Pennsylvania, tucked between old highways and stretches of forest that seemed to go on forever, there was a case so disturbing that it pushed seasoned detectives to walk away. Men and women who had seen the worst of what people could do to each other, who had carried bodies out of rivers and basements, who had stared into the blank eyes of killers and lived with the weight of unsolved files, found themselves unable to stay on this one. It wasn't because of politics or money or red tape. It was because of what they saw, what they heard, and what they could never explain. It started on a cold morning in late autumn when the air was heavy with fog and the trees stood bare, their branches like black veins against the gray sky. The call came into the county sheriff's office at 6:43 a.m. A hiker had found something strange in the woods behind an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The farmhouse itself was a relic, boarded up decades ago, its roof sagging, its porch collapsing into weeds. Locals called it cursed, though no one could ever agree on why. Some said it had belonged to a family who vanished. Others claimed it was once the site of rituals. Whatever the truth was, people avoided it. Except this hiker who had cut through the property to reach a creek and stumbled across what he thought at first was an animal carcass. By the time deputies arrived, it was clear it wasn't an animal. It was a person, or at least what was left of one. The body was found propped against the back wall of the farmhouse, seated upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there. The face was gone, not missing in the way an animal might eat flesh, but peeled away, as though someone had taken it off deliberately. The rest of the skin was marked with strange carvings, deep enough to scar bone. The initials of towns that were hours apart, symbols no one recognized. And the chest had been cut open, the rib cage pried apart, and inside, nothing. The organs were gone. Detectives who first took the case thought it might have been some kind of cult killing, ritualistic, brutal, something designed to terrify. But as they combed the area, they realized this wasn't the first. Deeper into the woods, less than a mile from the farmhouse, they found another. The same positioning, the same carvings, the same hollow chest. 2 victims, arranged like mannequins in the middle of nowhere. By afternoon, the entire property was taped off. Investigators in heavy jackets moved slowly, taking photographs, bagging evidence, whispering in tones that betrayed how uneasy they were. The smell was overwhelming, not just of death, but of something sour, chemical, almost metallic. Forensics couldn't place it. It clung to their clothes, their hair, even their cars after they left the site. One officer said it reminded him of copper pipes left to rot in the rain. Another said it smelled like blood boiled in acid. The victims were not immediately identified, their fingerprints weren't in the system, dental records came back with no matches. They were ghosts, as though they had appeared in those woods just to die. But when autopsies were performed, more disturbing details surfaced. The cuts on the body were precise, surgical, almost professional. Whoever did this had knowledge, steady hands, and time. But there was something else. Something no one wanted to admit. The bones showed signs of being burned. Not the flesh, just the bones inside the body, as if the fire had started within, leaving the skin untouched. One pathologist swore the marrow had been cooked into powder. When the first photographs of the victims made their way to the station, several officers turned pale, some couldn't finish their shift. These were men and women who had seen car crashes, shootings, suicides. But this was different. It didn't look like a murder for revenge, or money, or passion. It looked like something done for a purpose no one could comprehend. Something cold, something patient. The case stretched on for weeks. Detectives followed leads that went nowhere. A drifter was brought in, questioned for days, then released when nothing stuck. A group of self-proclaimed occultists in the next county were investigated, but their rituals turned out to be little more than candlelit chanting. The town grew tense, rumors spread faster than facts, parents kept their kids home from school, hunters refused to enter the woods. Everyone seemed to know someone who had seen something, a figure moving at night, strange lights near the farmhouse, whispers carried on the wind. Most of it was dismissed, until deputies themselves began to report things. One night, while canvassing the property, 2 deputies swore they saw a man standing at the edge of the tree line. Tall, motionless, watching. They called out, drew their weapons, and advanced. But when they reached the spot, the ground was soft with mud. No footprints, no broken branches. Nothing to suggest anyone had been there. The deputies were shaken enough to refuse night patrols afterward. Another detective reported hearing voices on her police radio. Not static, not interference, but actual voices, whispering, saying her name. The tech team tested the radio, found nothing wrong, and told her she was tired. But she knew what she heard. The next week, she resigned. The farmhouse itself became the center of obsession. Investigators searched every inch, pulling up floorboards, tearing through walls, shining lights into the cellar. They found old cans of food, rusted tools, rotting furniture, but nothing that explained the killings, except for one thing. In the attic, carved into the wood, were the same symbols that had been cut into the victims. Faded, but unmistakable. No one could determine how long they had been there. Some said decades. Others swore they looked fresh. The more they dug, the more the case seemed to unravel them. Detectives who had once prided themselves on rational thinking began to argue, lose sleep, drink heavily. One officer stopped showing up entirely, later telling friends he couldn't be near the evidence room anymore. He said every time he walked past it, he felt like someone inside was breathing. Another quit after waking up to find the case files spread across his kitchen floor, even though he lived alone and had locked them away in his office the night before. As months passed, more bodies appeared. Not many, but enough to show it wasn't over. Each one was found in increasingly remote places, abandoned barns, dried up wells, hollowed tree trunks. Always the same carvings. Always the same hollow chest, and always that smell, impossible to wash away. The public demanded answers, but there were none. Reporters pressed for details, but even they grew reluctant to publish what little they knew. It was as if the story itself carried a curse. Families moved away, the town's population dwindled, the farmhouse eventually collapsed in on itself after a storm, but even then, no one would go near the land. By the time the case was quietly filed into the cold case archives, more than half the original team had left the force. Some transferred, some retired early, some simply disappeared without explanation. Not a single detective wanted to touch it anymore. It wasn't because they couldn't solve it, it was because the case was doing something to them, changing them, and they were terrified of what would happen if they stayed. To this day, the boxes sit in storage, unmarked, gathering dust. Officers whisper about them like a warning. Some say if you open the files, you'll start seeing the same symbols in your own home. Some say you'll smell that metallic stench in your clothes. And some say the case isn't cold at all. It's just waiting for someone foolish enough to open it again. The vanishing case that terrified investigators. The first call landed at 9:12 p.m. on a drizzly Thursday along Highway 22, where the road slips past the dark water of Detroit Lake and into the timber that locals simply call the Ridge. The caller's voice was steady, then it wasn't. "My name is Evan Mercer," he said, breath shallow like he'd just jogged. "I pulled over at the mile marker with the broken green sign, the one with the bullet holes. There's... Hold on," Static hissed. A soft scrape, like a jacket sleeve, brushed against the phone. "There's someone in the trees. They're not moving right. They're not walking, they're not." The line crackled, then went silent for 3 long seconds. When the dispatcher asked him to repeat, Evan said, "Quieter. If I don't answer in a minute, please send someone. Please hurry." The call ended with a wet clicking sound, as if a tongue tapped the microphone, and nothing more. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Patrol car 3 King 7 reached the pullout at 9:27 p.m. and found an old F-150 idling with the driver's door ajar. The overhead light was on, and a thermos steamed faintly in the cup holder. A phone lay face down on the passenger seat, recording a 9-minute voice memo that the deputy, a calm woman named Lena Alvarez, downloaded on the spot. Her body camera caught everything. The first minute was just engine, rain, and a bright pulsing hum too low to be a siren. The rest was the sound of the forest taking slow breaths. Detective Rowan Hale arrived from the county office at 10:04 p.m., the kind of investigator who carried a metal tape measure and wrote times down to the second. He stood in the beam of his cruiser, a pale rectangle of light on wet asphalt, and listened to the lake pushing softly at the rocky shore below. Pines crowded the slope, black spears against a wool sky. The smell of hot engine blended with a sharp metallic odor, like a coin pressed hard to the tongue. "Mercer?" he called. The trees said nothing. They found footprints immediately. Evan stepped out of his truck in work boots, size 11, crossing the gravel shoulder toward the tree line. The rain softened the edges, but every other detail was crisp. Heel, arch, toe. Then the prints did something that made both investigators forget to breathe for a beat. They simply ended. Not faded, not scuffed away, stopped. The last print lay in the gravel mid-stride, the tiny stones within it undisturbed, as if the boot had pressed into powder that wasn't there, lifted, and left no next step. "Could be," he hopped, Deputy Alvarez whispered, not believing it. "Where to?" Hale said, and lifted his flashlight. The beam scanned the wet trunks. 10 feet in, a birch peeled a silver ribbon of bark. Farther back, the forest went so dark, the light seemed to fall into it. No dragging marks, no sliding mud, no impression of knees or hands, just the last step and the next step missing. At 10:22 p.m., the tow truck driver, a night owl named Beasley, who moved like he was always recovering from the last thing he saw, holstered his gloves and crossed himself when he looked at the prints. He said it without looking at the woods. "This place eats things." The search started by 11. State troopers, county volunteers, 2 SAR handlers with dogs, one named Gipper, the other Foxy, both usually eager to barrel into brush. They took one sniff of the air and sat. Not frightened exactly, braced, as if whatever their noses told them was both confusing and beneath their notice. When the handlers coaxed them forward, the dogs went a few yards into the trees, stopped at the last footprint, and stared at a point 3 feet above the ground, tails flat, heads tilted in the same uncanny angle as if they were listening to something no one else could hear. At 12:17 a.m., a deputy radioed a report of dim white lights flickering deeper in the trees. Hale and Alvarez pushed in to check. What they found was stranger than flashlights. 3 lengths of mylar, the kind used for emergency blankets, were snagged high on branches and rustled as the wind shifted. Their reflective surfaces shivered with every gust, throwing off weak glints like eyes. But there were no footprints beneath the trees they hung from. No sign anyone had climbed to place them. Hale measured the height with his stick. The lowest strip was more than 10 feet up. They set a perimeter anyway. They marked the last print with a yellow tent labeled A. The truck was taken back to the county lot by 1:05 a.m. Its cabin still warm, its radio presets set to classic rock, and a local AM station that would rattle with a sports talk show at noon. A coffee receipt in the cup holder said 8. 41 Pendemen, Cedar Mart, 2 miles east in the town of Gray Ridge. Population stitched together by the mill and the lake. The cashier on duty, a college kid named Jude, remembered Evan saying he needed caffeine for the drive back to Salem. He remembered Evan glancing toward the door as if someone had just passed by the glass. He looked spooked, Jude said at 1:53 a.m., sitting in a back office under buzzing fluorescent lights, steam rising from his instant noodles. Like when you see your reflection move the wrong way. The next morning broke flat and gray. The mountains wore a low band of cloud, the kind that never quite lifts. The wider team assembled at a trailhead with paper cups of donated coffee and stale sugar donuts, then fanned out in grids. That was when the first investigator said out loud that something about the place felt wrong. It wasn't superstition, it was a physical sensation, the way you notice silence only when it feels like weight. They kept finding things that should have belonged to Evan, except they couldn't prove they did. A key on a ring with no car fob wedged in moss. A strip of duct tape stuck to a rock, perfectly smooth as if it had never touched anything. A silver coin embedded in the mud so deeply that the date stamped on it had been polished smooth by grinding it against nothing. They also found a smear on a tree, low and oval and faintly oily to the touch, like a thumbprint the size of a dinner plate. The lab in Salem would later say it contained petroleum byproducts, cedar pollen, and something else not identified in their standard panel. The technician who gave that report sniffed and said the something else was probably an environmental contaminant, which was the exact phrasing a person uses when they want to be done thinking about what they touched. At 2:03 p.m., Alvarez went into the grocery on Main Street to talk to a woman named Mara Ellison, who held a paper cup in both hands as if she were trying to warm bone. He texted me at 8:47, she said, passing over her phone with the threads. The message read, "I'm fine, just grabbed coffee. The lake's got that weird low fog. It sits like it's thinking." Then at 9:06, "There's a green sign. Wind is kicking up. I hear something and then nothing else." She had called at 9:20 when he didn't answer. "He doesn't ghost me," she said, and the way she said it told them everything. Hale asked what Evan did for work. He managed a small warehouse, took weekend trips to fish, paid his bills on time, kept a list in his phone of guitar chords that sounded good after midnight. He wasn't running from anyone. He wasn't trying to disappear. He had a dent in his truck door that he still hadn't fixed because he said it made the truck look honest. He laughed at bad jokes and bought extra firewood for friends at campouts. That evening, he'd been headed home from a helper job at a friend's cabin on the far side of the lake. A normal day, nothing magic in it until it was. The traffic camera at mile marker 142 was an old unit bolted to a leaning pole, its feed flowing into a state server that an IT tech in Salem could pull within minutes. At 4:11 p.m., Hale and Alvarez sat in a dim room at the sheriff's office while the tech scrubbed back and forth across a sliver of time. 9:19 p.m. showed the edge of Evan's truck. 19:41 showed the door opening. At 9:19:52, a tall figure stepped into frame. At the bottom edge of the image, head bent, shoulders bunched against rain. At 19:57, Every pixel on the screen seemed to drag left by a hair, as if the world had been pulled in a single direction and then let go. It wasn't a full glitch, the timecode didn't skip, the sound didn't break. It looked like heat shimmer, but there was no heat. A moment later, the figure was gone. "Frame drop," the tech said, and then frowning, "except it isn't." He tapped keys, there's no missing data, the codec logged a continuous packet stream. He didn't like saying that. Sometimes these older units get interference. He made a show of checking for lightning strikes that never happened and solar activity that wasn't present either. When he left, the small room smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee, and Hale wrote the time down again, because writing times was how he kept a grip on what the world was supposed to do. The word for what the case did to investigators began as tired jokes. Maybe we should start charging the ghosts rent. By the third night, nobody joked. The third night was when Alvarez lost 41 seconds. It was 2:13 a.m. when she walked alone down the shoulder of the highway, past the pullout, body cam glowing a neat blue bead in the dark. The rain had thinned to mist that glittered in her beam. She narrated for the record the way they are trained. Alvarez walking southbound, wind negligible, pavement wet, no vehicles, audible lake wash to my left, smell of cedar. It's cold. Then she stopped speaking because she heard it. The hum. It was not electricity, it was not a plane, it was the noise a taut cable makes when the wind plucks it. It vibrated in her teeth. Her beam swung once across the trees and came back to the road, and then the video blurred, not in a smear, but in a folding. The yellow center line ahead of her looked like a ribbon being drawn into the woods, little key stitches of paint bending toward the trunks and then releasing. She took one more step and had the sensation of putting her foot down into air that did not expect it. The video never cut, the timestamp never jumped, but her voice, steadily narrating, was gone for 41 full seconds, replaced by soft rooftops of sound like waves falling over a gravel bar. When the sound of her voice returned, she was saying, "No, I'm good, I'm right here," and her breath was hitching. She stood on the shoulder with her hands braced on her knees, and the night came back in layers, wind in the mylar strips, a truck rumbling faintly miles away. Her own pulse drumming so loud inside her ears, it sounded like someone knocking from the inside of a closet. "You okay?" Hale said, moving to her, and she nodded too fast. She wouldn't describe what she saw fully for a day. When she finally did, she said it in a low, even tone at the end of a long interview. "The road tilted," she said. "Not the pavement, not the earth, the place where you decide which way to step. It tilted toward the trees. If something wanted a clean line, it would wipe the line you chose, and you'd walk into where nothing has a step." The case file swelled with interviews, maps, lists. Hale added a page about an earlier disappearance that the old-timers mentioned only if you prompted them with dates. A logger named Kenner went missing in roughly the same stretch, back when the mill still paid cash at the end of the week and the tavern stayed open until sunrise. According to a man named Fielder, who kept a ledger of local deaths because the county clerk's office was a 50-minute drive, Kenner's truck had also been found idling with its lights on and his lunch pail still latched. The printout with an excerpt from that ledger became tab 23. In pencil, Hale wrote in the margin, "Pattern." By day 5, the search scaled down. It always does. People have jobs, fuel costs, the lake never stops pushing at the rocks, and even grief must sleep. Yet every night at 2-something in the morning, the AM band on the radio at the sheriff's office shivered into a non-signal, a dead station that rattled. When you turn the dial through it, the numbers 739 seemed to whisper past in sequence 3 or 4 times. Not a full voice, just a cadence. The repairs crew came in and tightened everything, and the sound came back anyway. Then, a small thing that got under everyone's skin, A janitor named Ruth found the chain from Evan's keyring lying on the tile in the hallway outside the evidence room one morning when she came in a few minutes before sunrise. It was the cheap kind of chain made of tiny balls. It had a small kink in it that Mara later said she recognized, and the link that would have held a fob was bent, as if someone had tried and failed to add a key in a hurry. The inventory log showed the keyring inside the sealed bag inside the locked cabinet. The bag weighed the same, looked the same, sat exactly where it should have been, and when they opened it, the chain was intact and the kink was where Mara remembered. The chain in the hall, same length, same feel, sat on Hale's desk in a small dish for the rest of the month, and people avoided looking at it because it was easier to pretend that kind of duplication belonged to a mistake. At 10:13 p.m. on day 7, a man drifting a small aluminum boat along the north shore of the lake called in a sighting. He said a white shape moved among the trees near the mile marker, a pale figure gliding parallel to the shore and then stopping. He rowed closer. The shape was a refrigerator box, flayed open on one side and flapping in the breeze, caught between trunks. When officers hauled it out, they found the inside lined with, of all things, pages from a guitar chord book glued into a collage of E minor and D7 and A4. Every page split and overlapped so that none of the chords formed a full diagram. The paper was dry. Hale wrote the time down anyway. He did not say anything about the list in Evan's phone of chords he liked after midnight. Night 9 was when it turned personal enough to break the last of the gallows humor. Hale woke in his room at the Cedar Motor Lodge at 2:16 a.m. to the soft hum. It vibrated the window glass. He sat up and put his feet on the carpet and felt the pressure in the air as if a storm were about to hit. The red numbers of the clock read 2:17. He stood, crossed to the sink, and turned on the tap for noise, then turned it off again because the water came out in staccato bursts like it was remembering how to be water. The chain on his door clicked once with no one touching it. He would not write that in the report because even he had a line he didn't want to cross. But he wrote the time, 2:18. He stared at the door long enough to hear the people next door whispering through thin drywall. A woman's voice said, "Don't say it out loud," and a man's voice said, "We didn't." By then, Gray Ridge's rumor mill was grinding full speed. The woman who ran the pie shop on Main told anyone who would listen that she had driven past that mile marker around 10 p.m. the week before and watched her dashboard clock stutter backward from 10, 7 to 10, 5, and then tick forward again like a skip in a record. A youth pastor from the church near the school said he'd hiked the ridge years ago and felt his legs tremble in a patch of sunlight that shouldn't have been there because the canopy was too dense. A retired surveyor named Orville talked about a singing wire he'd heard when he was a young man stringing telephone lines, the kind of sound that makes your fillings itch. He said the ridge had its own weather. He said not to whistle there at night. He said a lot of things, and then he said nothing at all and rocked gently on his heels. 2 weeks in, the official search scaled down again. The case file thickened with the weight of pages you only read when you have to. Hale kept going to the lake at night. He wore the same heavy jacket, ate the same vending machine granola bar, and wrote times as if each time could anchor a thing that didn't want to be held. At 1:59 a.m. On one of those nights, he measured the distance from the last print to the first tree 3 times and got 3 different numbers. Not different by much, by 1.5 inches, by 2 inches, by 9/16. The kind of differences that make you double-check your hands. He measured a length of rope along the shoulder, 250 feet, and when he rolled it back up, his hands were shaking so badly that the rope slipped, and he had to start again. When he measured it the second time, it was missing 11 inches. He cut a new piece from a fresh spool and measured again. 250 feet on the nose. He did not put the 11-inch short rope in the evidence room. He kept it in his trunk because he didn't want to know what the evidence room would do with it. On a quiet afternoon in the third week, the county received a voicemail stamped with the date of the night Evan vanished and delivered by the network 3 weeks late. The message came to Mara's phone first, then was forwarded to the sheriff. It was short, wind in a speaker, the sound of a shoe scuffing gravel, a man's voice, breathless but not panicked, saying, "Do not step or you cannot hear your feet," and then a singular knock, as if a knuckle had tapped an empty wooden box. The line ended on a small intake of breath, cut clean. The carrier said towers sometimes backlog, messages sometimes float in the system, and there was nothing more they could explain. At 3:23 p.m., one day, a volunteer named Naomi Pike, who wrote about strange disappearances for a small website and had the polite eyes of someone who knows when she's not wanted, brought photocopies of old news clippings about the lake before it became the lake. Down Valley communities flooded, whole stands of trees drowned when the dam closed and the water rose, stoves and fence posts and tomato cages at the bottom of a mild cold sea. One article quoted an older ranger, long dead now, muttering on record that the ridge made compasses slow. Naomi handed everything over without flourish and went back to her rental car. Her taillights glowed red against the rain as she pulled away, then dissolved into gray. The same afternoon, the state tech sent an email about the traffic camera feed saying he'd found tiny backlog in the buffer at 19 that night. A few extra kilobytes whispering through the stream. Nothing meaningful, just noise. Harmless, he wrote. Artifact of packet repair. He added a smiley face. When Hale read that line, he stood abruptly, walked outside into the wind, and stood under the bare flagpole until the wind cut his eyes and he felt calmer. There were more calls at night. A man who swore he saw a figure standing in the shallow wash at the lake's edge looking out at the black water. Both hands raised like he was warming them over a fire no one else could see. A pair of night fishermen who heard a voice say hello from just behind them and then repeat it in a lower octave, as if two throats had learned the word together. Two teenagers who parked at the pullout and joked loudly to keep brave until they noticed all the night insects had gone silent at once, as if a hand had pressed down on a switch, and they drove away so fast they forgot to switch on their headlight. Then, one more thing that turned the case from frightening to personal for the people wearing the badges. At 2:31 a.m., the day before the file was supposed to be transferred to a colder desk, Alvarez was typing up a supplemental when her monitor blinked black and came back with a blinking cursor inside a blank report she had not opened. The cursor jumped on its own. A single word appeared in the field where the case name should go. Here. Then nothing, and the monitor returned to her report as if she had never left it. She stared until the clock at the bottom corner ticked over to 2:33. She saved her report, closed the lid, and felt her throat press shut like a hand had rested around it. She signed off early and drove to the lake. She stopped 100 yards short of the pullout. She turned off her lights and sat in the dark, listening. She did not get out. She did not press record. She did not narrate. She did not breathe for a count of 4. After a minute, she heard the softest sound, like boot leather bending, as someone shifted their weight from one foot to the other. She thought, with sudden clarity, that the worst part of this job had never been the blood or the lies. It was the moments when you knew you were hearing something meant for you. By dawn, she made a decision. She told Hale 2 hours later, standing beside the coffee machine while it groaned out a thin stream. "I can't do nights there anymore," she said. "Not for a while." He nodded as if she had told him the sky had a color. He signed the form that moved her temporarily to day shifts and wrote the time, 10:21 a. He would tell his wife later that he had never been proud of a signature before. Officially, the Mercer case never reached a conclusion. The file thickened and then stopped. The press releases used phrases like pending new information and no evidence of foul play found at this time, which is what you write when every possibility has crawled under the bed to hide from daylight. People still drive past the green sign with the bullet holes, and at night they glance in their mirrors between mile markers 141 and 143 without knowing why. The strange part isn't how it ended. The strange part is how it kept touching things after it should have gone still. Months later, a family walking the shoreline in April found a sealed jar in a tangle of drift close to the pullout. Inside, folded tight, was a page torn neatly from a spiral notebook. The page was blank at first glance. Only when they tilted it toward the sun did they see faint writing impressed into the paper, as if someone had written on a page above it and the pressure left ghosts of letters. It read, in sharp, ordinary handwriting, "Never step where sound has left." The letters walked down the page and thinned at the end. The jar lid was on tight. There was no water inside. The family turned the jar in to the county without their names. The clerk who accepted it put it on a shelf to be logged after lunch. When she came back, the jar was gone, and in its place sat a silver coin pressed so clean you couldn't read the date. On some nights, if you tune your car radio to the broken AM station near the lake, the dial will tremble as you pass that stretch, and a low thrumming will pulse through the speakers like the space between heartbeats. A voice, maybe the same voice that warned the dispatcher, maybe not, will rise out of static for just a moment. You won't catch the words. You'll only feel your feet on the pedals, your hands on the wheel, and the peculiar awareness that you are crossing a place where the world forgets its lines. Keep driving. Keep your tires on the painted edge. Count out loud if you have to. Hear your step. And if you stop, if you ease onto the gravel and lower your window and listen, the night will offer you the gentle wash of the lake, the whisper of wind through fir needles, and that thin cable hum plucked by nothing human. You will think about a man who stepped toward the trees with his shoulders hunched against rain. You will look down and see your own footprint, clean in the grit, and you will see that there is a space ahead of it where the next print should go and does not. Your mind will fill the blank with stories, so you can move. Choose one, make it a good one, bring it with you as you turn back to the wheel. Drive. The ridge will watch you leave and fold the sound of your engine carefully away, as if it has been saving a quiet place for it all along. Some cases terrified because of what they show you. This one terrifies because of what it takes away, one step at a time, until the distance between footsteps becomes a place all its own. When the investigators finally closed their notebooks and turned off their recorders, the lake kept breathing. The ridge kept humming. And somewhere, just past the broken green sign, the last clear footprint in the gravel waited under a thin coat of dust for the next person who leaned too close to the line where the world forgets to make the next step. The mystery that drove detectives insane. It began on a gray October morning when the quiet town of Ashford, nestled deep in the hills of Pennsylvania, awoke to the kind of silence that feels unnatural, the kind of silence that makes you feel as though the world is holding its breath. The town was small, a place where neighbors knew each other's names, where the grocery clerk asked about your children, and where life moved at a pace that never felt rushed. But on that morning, when the air was heavy with fog and the streets glistened from a night of steady rain, the calm routine of the town was about to be torn apart. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? At exactly 7:42 a.m. A call came in to the county sheriff's office. The voice on the other end was trembling, uneven, as if struggling to form the words. A man named Harold Turner, a truck driver who had pulled over to check his tires near an abandoned farmhouse on Old Mill Road, claimed he had seen something so disturbing that his voice broke while describing it. He insisted there was a figure lying motionless in the grass beside the farmhouse, and strange markings covering the walls as if someone had gone mad with red paint. Within minutes, 2 deputies were dispatched, and by 8:15 a.m., the first reports began filtering back. It was not paint. The walls of the decaying farmhouse were covered in streaks of blood. And the body lying in the tall, wet grass was not just any body. It was positioned in such a deliberate and unnatural way that it sent chills through even the most seasoned officers. Arms extended straight out, legs bent at sharp angles, and the head tilted to face the sky with eyes wide open, as though the victim had been forced into a grotesque pose before life was taken from them. The coroner was called, and as the body was examined, it was revealed that the victim had no identification, no wallet, no phone, nothing to indicate who they were. Their clothes were generic, the kind one might buy at any discount store, but there was something unusual. Sewn into the lining of the jacket was a small piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age, on which strange symbols were scrawled in dark ink. No one at the scene could decipher it. By late morning, detectives from the county's investigative unit arrived. Among them was Detective Marshall, a man with 20 years on the force, known for his calm under pressure, and Detective Reeves, younger but sharp, with a reputation for connecting dots that others overlooked. As they stepped inside the farmhouse, both men felt something shift in their stomachs. The air was thick, damp, and filled with the sour smell of rot. The wooden floors creaked as though groaning under an unseen weight, and the blood smeared across the walls seemed to form patterns rather than random splatters. Reeves muttered under his breath, pointing at the largest smear on the far wall. It was not just blood, but a circle, crudely drawn, with jagged lines cutting through it like rays. Around it were smaller markings, symbols that matched the parchment hidden in the victim's coat. No fingerprints, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Whoever had done this had moved with precision, leaving behind something that felt more like a message than a crime scene. Word of the discovery spread quickly, and soon the small town was drowning in rumor. Some whispered about cult activity, others about a drifter passing through, and some insisted it was something darker, something that could not be explained by rational means. The local newspaper printed a front-page story calling it "The Ritual on Old Mill Road," and overnight fear rooted itself in the town's heart. The investigation deepened. The victim's fingerprints were run through every available database, but there was no match. Dental records revealed nothing. It was as though the person had never officially existed. And then, just as detectives were grappling with this void of information, another discovery was made. Exactly 1 week after the farmhouse incident, at the same time in the morning, another body appeared. This time on the steps of the old courthouse downtown, a place long abandoned and condemned, its windows shattered and its halls crawling with vines. Once again, the body was arranged in a twisted pose with a parchment hidden in the clothing. The symbols matched. The blood painted across the courthouse doors formed another strange pattern, different from the first, but equally deliberate. Detectives Marshall and Reeves felt the weight of something that was no longer a simple crime. These were not random murders, not crimes of passion or opportunity. Someone was leaving behind a trail, constructing something larger than any of them could comprehend. The two men pored over the parchments late into the night, spreading them across the desk under dim fluorescent lights. They called in experts from nearby universities, linguists, historians, even cryptographers. Each one studied the markings, and each one came back with the same unsettling response. The symbols did not belong to any known language, any known culture. They seemed invented, yet carried a strange logic of their own, as though designed to communicate something beyond human understanding. As the weeks passed, the murders continued. Every 7 days, like clockwork, another body appeared in another forgotten place around the county. An abandoned church, a railway tunnel, a shuttered motel on the edge of town. Always the same patterns, always the same symbols, always the same absence of identity in the victims, and always the same growing sense of dread among the investigators. Detective Marshall, who had once prided himself on rationality, began to lose sleep. He confessed to Reeves that he heard whispers at night, voices that seemed to come from nowhere, repeating words he could not understand. Reeves, though skeptical, admitted that he too felt a constant pressure, a sense of being watched when alone. Their colleagues noticed their decline. What had begun as a case had become an obsession, one that clawed at their sanity with every passing day. The media attention swelled, with reporters descending on Ashford, painting it as a town cursed, a place gripped by an unseen terror. Residents began locking their doors before sundown, avoiding the streets after dark. Churches filled with people desperate for comfort, while others fled the town entirely. Businesses closed, leaving storefronts empty. The once quiet community had been hollowed out, consumed by fear. Then came the night that finally broke the detectives. It was bitterly cold, with frost coating the ground like glass. A call came in at 3:17 a.m., reporting movement at the abandoned railway tunnel where one of the bodies had been found. Marshall and Reeves rushed to the scene, flashlights cutting through the icy darkness. As they stepped inside the tunnel, their beams illuminated something that stopped them cold. The walls were no longer streaked with old graffiti, but covered in fresh blood, thick and wet, spelling out words they could almost read. As they moved deeper, the symbols began to shift, curving into forms that resembled letters, as though the unknown language had begun merging with English. And at the far end of the tunnel, sitting upright against the wall, was a figure they recognized. It was Harold Turner, the truck driver who had first called in the farmhouse discovery. His eyes were open, his expression frozen in terror, his hands clutching another parchment. On it, scrawled in shaky handwriting that was unmistakably human this time, were the words, "They are coming and you cannot stop them." The sound that followed was one Marshall would never forget. A low hum vibrating through the steel of the tunnel, so deep it rattled their bones. Reeves dropped his flashlight, and in that moment of darkness, something moved. Not footsteps, not the shifting of a person, but a ripple, as though the air itself was alive. When they scrambled back toward the entrance, both men swore they saw shadows that did not belong to them, stretching unnaturally along the walls, reaching out like hands. In the weeks that followed, the case unraveled. Reports were filed, but the words within them made no sense. Evidence vanished from storage, parchments crumbled to dust as though they had never existed. The higher authorities dismissed it all as hysteria, a town caught in the grip of collective fear. Detectives who had worked themselves to exhaustion and lost their grip on reality. Marshall resigned not long after, retreating to a cabin in the woods where no one could reach him. Reeves disappeared entirely, his apartment left unlocked, his belongings untouched, as though he had simply walked out and never returned. The murders stopped as abruptly as they had begun, leaving behind no answers, only scars. To this day, the story of Ashford is whispered about in Pennsylvania, the tale of a mystery so profound it drove the best detectives to madness. Some claim it was a cult, others that it was something far older, something that had slipped into our world for reasons no one could explain. But those who were closest to it know one thing. It was not a case that could be solved. It was a message and perhaps a warning. And sometimes, late at night, in the silence of those empty streets, locals say you can still hear it. That low hum, faint but unmistakable, rolling through the hills like a promise. A sound that reminds them the mystery was never truly over. It was only waiting. Disturbing files that were never released. There are some cases in American history that remain so unsettling, so deeply disturbing, that the files connected to them were sealed away, hidden from the public eye. Not because of national security, but because those who saw what was inside could not bring themselves to ever let it be released. These are the files that were whispered about in dimly lit hallways of police stations, the ones that detectives carried in thick folders stained with coffee rings, marked only with red tape and stamped with the word restricted. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It began in a small town tucked deep in the Midwest, a quiet place where most people knew one another. Life moved slowly there, the nights silent except for crickets and the occasional hum of a passing train. But in late autumn, when the days grew short and the air carried that sharp chill, something happened that would tear at the seams of reality itself. On a gray afternoon, a woman walked into the county sheriff's office. Her hair was damp from the drizzle outside, her eyes wide, and her voice shook as she explained that her brother hadn't been home for 3 days. He wasn't the type to vanish. He worked at the mill, showed up on time, paid his bills, and never left town without saying a word. But now his car sat abandoned on the edge of a service road near the woods, keys still in the ignition, driver's door wide open. When deputies first went to investigate, they expected to find a man who had simply wandered off or had some kind of accident. But the scene gave them no comfort. The car sat oddly positioned, not on the road itself, but angled sharply into the ditch as if it had stopped suddenly. The interior was undisturbed, wallet still in the glove box, and nothing was stolen. What caught their attention most was a smear of something on the back seat. At first, they thought it was mud, but under the flashlight's beam, it carried a darker tone, clotted and rust-colored. Blood. Deputies called for backup, and soon the woods were alive with searchers. Flashlights cut through the thick pines, dogs barked, and the cold drizzle turned the earth into slick mud. Hours passed. No sign of the man, but in the farthest part of the woods, near a clearing that hunters sometimes used, they found something else. Laid out on the wet ground was a collection of papers. Dozens of pages, their corners warped from moisture, each one covered in typed lines and handwritten notes. The documents were old, far older than the man's disappearance, but there was something about them that made the deputies uneasy. They seemed to describe medical procedures, but not the kind anyone had ever read before. Descriptions of experiments carried out on unwilling subjects, with dates, times, and initials scrawled in the margins. At first, deputies assumed it was a hoax, some kind of strange prank left behind by kids. But the more they read, the more it became clear these pages weren't written for amusement. They spoke of things done to people who had been taken against their will, procedures that defied normal medical standards, procedures that no ethical board would ever approve. The man's body was never found. Not that night, not the next day, not even in the weeks that followed. But the documents were collected, sealed in evidence bags, and locked away. That should have been the end, but it wasn't. Within a month, another disappearance was reported, this time a teenage girl who had last been seen walking home from her friend's house. Again, her belongings were found abandoned. This time her backpack tossed at the side of a road as if it had been dropped mid-stride. When searchers combed the nearby fields, they found more papers, this time carefully folded and placed inside a glass jar. And once again, the writings detailed horrific acts along with disturbing sketches of human figures, drawn crudely but clear enough to show what was being done. By now, the sheriff's department was overwhelmed. They requested assistance from state police, who in turn passed the case upward. Soon, federal agents arrived in black sedans, the kind of men who didn't smile and didn't share what they knew. They collected everything, the papers, the photographs that had been taken at the scenes, even the deputies' handwritten notes, and took them to a secure facility. The files grew thicker as the months dragged on. More disappearances followed, though not always in the same county. Sometimes in neighboring states, sometimes miles away, but always with the same calling card, strange documents left behind, typed in the same font, marked with the same initials. The people who read them said the files had a way of staying with you, even when you tried to forget. Investigators described dreams that woke them in the night, filled with voices that weren't theirs, faces they had never seen, and an overwhelming sense of dread that followed them through the day. Some agents requested transfers. Some simply quit. A few reportedly disappeared themselves. The towns where these events unfolded changed too. Businesses closed early, streets emptied after dark, and rumors spread that the woods were cursed. Parents no longer let their children walk alone. And yet, despite all the fear, There were never any arrests, never a suspect brought into custody. The files sat in storage, gathering dust, locked behind steel cabinets and guarded by silence. One retired officer, years later, confessed to a reporter that he had seen a portion of the files before they were taken away. His hands trembled as he described what he read, detailed accounts of people being subjected to tests in underground facilities, places no one could identify on any map. He said the files contained photographs too, grainy and poorly lit, but horrifying in their clarity. They showed rooms lined with rusted tables, restraints bolted into concrete floors, and people staring blankly into the lens, as though whatever had been done to them had hollowed them out completely. That officer broke down before he could finish. No one knows for certain who wrote the documents or why they were always found near the sites of disappearances. Some believe it was the work of a cult, others whisper about government experiments long denied. But those who have seen even a glimpse of the evidence agree on one thing. The files should never be released, not because the truth would be too confusing, but because it would be too devastating. The story of those disturbing files has become almost a legend in law enforcement circles. Sometimes, new recruits are warned with a simple phrase, "There are cases you don't want to dig into," cases where the answers, if found, would leave you broken. And when the lights flicker in the records room late at night, clerks whisper about the sealed cabinets, the ones marked with red tape, and the cases no one is allowed to open. The creepy legend that turned out to be real. There are places in America that carry a darkness with them, a weight that people feel the moment they step foot near them. Towns where locals whisper warnings, where stories are told to scare children into obedience, yet deep down, those same children know the stories were not just to frighten them, they were to protect them. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On the edge of a quiet town in Pennsylvania stood an abandoned farmhouse that no one dared approach after sunset. The house sat along a narrow dirt road, hidden behind rows of tall skeletal trees that looked almost like they were trying to conceal it. The wooden boards were weathered and gray, with the roof sagging inward and broken shutters hanging by rusted hinges. To anyone passing by, it was just another decaying building in the countryside, but for the people who lived nearby, it was known as the house that should never be entered. The legend had been whispered for decades. People spoke of screams that carried through the woods at night, of lantern lights flickering in the upper windows, even though the place had no electricity. Travelers claimed to see a figure standing motionless at the end of the road, a silhouette with no face, before it suddenly vanished. The story went further, darker, telling of a family who once lived there, a family that had mysteriously vanished one cold November night. No one could ever explain what happened, but when authorities entered the farmhouse, they said the dinner table was set as if the family had been about to eat. The food was untouched, and the chairs were neatly tucked in. It was as though the people had simply stood up, walked out into the woods, and never returned. For years, nobody dared to touch the property. Nature reclaimed the land, vines crept up the siding, and the windows were clouded with grime. But the legend lived on. High school students dared each other to walk up the road on Halloween, and some swore they heard footsteps following them even when no one was behind them. Others spoke of whispers drifting through the night air, soft and urgent, urging them to turn back before it was too late. It was late October when three friends from town decided they were going to prove the stories were nothing more than exaggerated tales. The evening had turned colder than expected, and the wind carried with it the smell of damp leaves and distant wood smoke. The group parked their car along the edge of the old road and began walking toward the house with only their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, unnervingly quiet, as if the entire forest was listening. When the farmhouse came into view, one of them muttered that it felt wrong to be there. The others laughed nervously, insisting it was just an old house, nothing more. But as they drew closer, the temperature dropped sharply and their breath came out in white clouds. They noticed that the front door was slightly ajar, creaking gently with each gust of wind. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and rot. Their footsteps echoed on the warped floorboards as dust swirled in the beam of their flashlights. Faded wallpaper peeled from the walls, and in the kitchen, the old dining table still stood, covered in a thick layer of dust. Plates and silverware were still neatly arranged, as if waiting for a meal that never came. One of the friends reached out and touched the back of a chair, only to pull his hand back quickly. The wood felt strangely warm, as though someone had just been sitting there. They laughed nervously again, trying to convince themselves it was just their imagination, but unease had already set in. In the silence, they thought they heard something upstairs. A slow, deliberate creak, like a footstep on the old boards above them. They froze, holding their breath, staring at one another with wide eyes. One whispered that it was probably just the house settling, but deep down, none of them believed that. Against their better judgment, they climbed the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under their weight, and each movement felt like it echoed far too loudly. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors that hung crooked on their frames. They pushed one open and found a bedroom. The bed still made, though the sheets were yellowed with age. A child's toy sat on the dresser, its once bright paint faded, and as one of them shined a light on it, the toy suddenly tipped over on its own. The sound of it hitting the wood made all of them jump back in fear. Another creak echoed from the far end of the hallway, and this time, it was unmistakable. Someone was walking. Slow, heavy steps, drawing closer. The air grew colder with every second. So cold their fingers ached as they gripped their flashlights tighter. One of them whispered they should leave, but when they turned to head back, the staircase was no longer visible. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretched into darkness that hadn't been there moments earlier. Panic set in. They began moving quickly, trying door after door, but each room looked the same. A bed, a dresser, peeling wallpaper. It was as if the house was rearranging itself around them, refusing to let them out. Then came the sound that made their blood run cold. A voice. Not loud, not clear, but a soft whisper, calling their names. The voice was distorted, almost gurgling like it came from underwater. And it wasn't just one voice, but several, overlapping, whispering in unison. Their flashlights flickered, plunging them into brief pockets of darkness. In those moments, they swore they saw shadows moving across the walls, figures just out of reach, taller than any human should be. One of them screamed, pointing at the end of the hall. Standing there was a figure, tall and thin, its face nothing more than a pale blur. It tilted its head unnaturally far to the side, and the whispers grew louder, rushing into their ears until they could barely think. They ran, bursting into room after room, trying desperately to find the staircase again, but the layout made no sense. Doors led to dead ends, and windows that should have opened to the outside revealed only more darkness, like an endless void pressing against the glass. Then, without warning, they found themselves back in the kitchen. The table stood there, just as before, but this time the plates were no longer empty. Each one was filled with rotting, mold-covered food. The chairs were pulled out, as though someone had just been sitting there waiting for them to arrive. One of the friends collapsed in terror, sobbing uncontrollably, while the others pulled at the front door. At first, it wouldn't budge, as if the house itself was holding it shut. Then, with a violent crack, it burst open, and they stumbled out into the freezing night air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, hearts pounding, lungs burning, unable to shake the feeling that something was still following them. When they finally made it back to town, they were pale and trembling, barely able to explain what had happened. They swore they would never return, and in the days that followed, each of them suffered strange disturbances. Footsteps in their homes at night, whispers in their ears when no one was there, and dreams of the faceless figure watching them from the shadow. Years later, people still avoid the farmhouse. The story of those three friends only added to the legend, fueling the warnings that locals passed down. Some say the house is a trap, built not to shelter a family, but to lure the living inside and keep them there forever. Others claim the family that vanished never truly left, that their restless spirits still wander the halls, whispering for company in the endless dark. What makes the legend truly terrifying is that it has never faded. New reports surface every so often. A hiker who got too close to the road swore he saw a lantern light flickering in the upstairs window. A driver passing by late at night claimed a figure stepped into the road and then disappeared into thin air. Some say if you stand outside the farmhouse at midnight, you can hear the sound of chairs scraping across the wooden floor, and if you don't leave immediately, you'll never walk out again. The farmhouse still stands, decaying but undefeated, as if time itself refuses to touch it. And the legend remains alive, not just a tale to scare children, but a reminder that some places carry with them a darkness that cannot be explained, a darkness that does not let go. The creepy legend turned out to be real, and anyone who doubts it only needs to step onto that lonely dirt road at night. If they listen closely, they'll hear the whispers waiting for them, calling them by name, ready to welcome them into the house that never lets go. Cases too disturbing for the headlines. On a cold evening in late autumn, when the air carried that sharp bite that seemed to creep straight into the bones, a small town in Pennsylvania found itself at the center of a nightmare that would never be printed in its local paper. The town was quiet. Rows of dimly lit houses along narrow streets, the kind of place where people locked their doors but still trusted their neighbors enough to wave goodnight. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there until one night when something so disturbing unfolded that even the most hardened investigators struggled to put it into words. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? It began just after 9 when a call came into the county sheriff's office. A neighbor reported hearing screams coming from a farmhouse that stood on the edge of town. The farmhouse was old, weathered wood splintering beneath layers of paint that had long since given up fighting the years. For decades, it had been home to a family that mostly kept to themselves. The caller's voice shook as he described the sound, high-pitched, ragged, not the kind of cry you'd expect from someone startled or angry. It was the kind of scream that made the hair on your arms stand straight, the kind that hinted at something primal, something wrong. 2 deputies arrived on scene within minutes. The yard was silent, the gravel driveway scattered with wet leaves, the porch light flickered, swaying slightly in the wind. They approached cautiously, knocking on the door, announcing themselves. No answer. What they found when they stepped inside would haunt them for years to come. The living room smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Furniture was overturned, photographs shattered on the floor, glass crunching under their boots. The deputies moved slowly, flashlights cutting through the shadows. In the kitchen, the table was set for dinner, plates still warm, food untouched. Chairs lay scattered as though people had been startled in the middle of a meal, and then in the hallway leading to the bedrooms, they saw it. Dark streaks along the wall, smeared handprints dragged downward, as though someone had clawed desperately at the surface trying to hold on. The prints led toward a closed door at the far end. With weapons drawn, they pushed forward, calling out again. No response. When the door swung open, the beam of light revealed a scene that froze them in place. 3 family members were there, lifeless, positioned in a way that was almost deliberate, as if staged. Eyes wide, mouths slightly open, their bodies placed side by side on the floor. Each one had marks around the wrists, as though bound at some point, but the restraints were gone. And the most chilling part, each had the same expression of terror carved across their face, as though whatever they had seen in their final moments was far worse than the violence itself. The 4th member of the household, the youngest, was nowhere to be found. Search teams combed the fields behind the farmhouse, flashlights bobbing in the night, calling out her name. Hours passed with no trace. The woods felt oppressive, the air unnaturally still, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath heavy boots. When dawn broke, investigators found a trail leading deeper into the trees, small footprints pressed into the damp earth, ending abruptly at a creek that wound its way through the forest. There, half buried in mud, was a single shoe. The child was never seen again. News outlets picked up whispers of the case, but details were scarce. The sheriff's office refused to release photographs, citing their disturbing nature. Local reporters who pressed too hard were warned off, told that some things were better left unsaid. The official story spoke only of a tragic incident, no specifics, no follow-up. To this day, the files remain sealed, stored in a cabinet deep within the county courthouse basement, marked with a single word across the folder: withheld. But that was only one case. Years later, hundreds of miles away, in a small town in Kentucky, another story unfolded that shared the same unnerving silence in its aftermath. It was late summer when a young couple driving home along a rural highway spotted something unusual. Just past midnight, headlights caught the figure of a man standing in the middle of the road. He didn't move, didn't flinch at the blaring horn. The couple swerved, heart pounding, pulling to the shoulder. When they looked back, the man was gone. Shaken, they continued on, only to find a pickup truck parked half a mile ahead, engine still running, driver's door wide open. The radio played softly inside, static breaking through faint country music. A wallet sat on the dashboard, filled with cash and identification. But the driver was nowhere in sight. Deputies searched the area until sunrise. In the nearby field, they found strange patterns carved into the grass, wide circles pressed flat, as if something massive had landed there. The missing man's footprints were scattered, moving in frantic directions before cutting off completely at the edge of one of the circles. No signs of struggle, no evidence of where he went. The case was quietly filed as a missing person. But investigators who had seen the scene spoke privately of something they couldn't explain. The story never reached the papers. There are dozens more hidden away in forgotten archives. In a small Illinois town, a family disappeared overnight, their house left perfectly intact, dinner dishes still in the sink, laundry folded neatly on the couch, even the family dog locked inside the bedroom, barking frantically when police entered. Every trace of the family was gone. No sign of forced entry, no struggle, just silence. Weeks of searching turned up nothing. Eventually, the house was sold, repainted, and passed to a new family. But neighbors whispered about lights flickering in the windows late at night, shadows moving when the house should have been empty. None of those reports were ever taken seriously. The official story vanished into silence. And in Oregon, a group of hikers stumbled across something they would never forget. Deep in the woods, miles from any trail, they found a clearing filled with dozens of animal bones arranged in intricate patterns. At the center, a large wooden cross stood upright, draped in torn pieces of clothing. Tucked into the branches above, a weathered photograph of a child smiled down, pinned with rusted nails. Authorities who investigated labeled it a disturbed individual's work, dismissed it as unsettling but not criminal. Yet those who saw it firsthand swore that the bones weren't all animal. Some, they insisted, looked far too human. These are cases too disturbing for the headlines, stories that never made it to the evening news, hidden behind closed doors and sealed files. They are spoken about in hushed tones by investigators long since retired, men and women who wake in the night with memories of things they cannot forget. The public will never know the full details. Perhaps it is mercy, perhaps it is fear. Because sometimes what really happens in the shadows of small towns and quiet highways is far worse than any headline could ever capture. And sometimes the silence that follows is the loudest sound of all. A murder mystery too twisted to solve. It was late evening when the wind began to stir through the quiet streets of a small town in northern America. The sky was heavy with clouds, the moon only occasionally breaking through, casting pale light over the narrow roads. In the distance, the sound of a church bell echoed faintly, almost swallowed by the cold air. At that very moment, no one realized that something dreadful was about to unfold, something that would haunt investigators and residents alike for years to come. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? The town was the kind of place where everyone believed they knew each other. Houses stood close together, with porches that looked out toward empty sidewalks. Street lamps flickered as if struggling to keep their glow alive. It was just after 10 p.m. when the local police received a call that changed everything. A neighbor, shaken and out of breath, reported screams coming from the house at the corner of Willow Street. The screams were sharp, desperate, and then, suddenly, they stopped. When the first patrol car arrived, the neighborhood was already on edge. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, and uneasy faces peeked out. The house in question stood silent, its front porch lights swinging in the wind as if someone had passed under it in a hurry. Officers knocked on the door but received no answer. After a tense moment, they forced their way inside. The interior of the house felt wrong immediately. A faint smell of iron filled the air, unmistakably metallic. The living room was dim, the lamp knocked over, casting eerie shadows across the walls. A half-finished cup of coffee still sat on the table, steam long gone, as if someone had been interrupted mid-sip. In the kitchen, chairs were overturned, one of them broken at the leg. And then, in the hallway, they found it. A body lying face down, blood pooled beneath. The victim had been struck repeatedly, the brutality suggesting rage more than intention. What made it all the more disturbing was the detail that none of the doors or windows had been forced open. Whoever did this had either been let inside willingly or was already in the house. By midnight, detectives were swarming the scene. One of them, a seasoned investigator who had seen his share of violence, admitted quietly that this case felt different, darker somehow. The victim's belongings were untouched, wallet and jewelry left behind, ruling out robbery. A series of photographs were discovered scattered on the floor, showing the victim with various friends and family. Yet, one photo stood out. It had been ripped in half, the missing piece showing only a shadow where another person had once been. The autopsy revealed something that sent chills even deeper. The injuries did not match a single weapon. It looked as though multiple methods had been used, almost ritualistic in nature. The coroner's report mentioned hesitation wounds, as if the killer had changed their mind halfway through, then continued with even greater force. As the investigation widened, the neighbors began sharing fragments of strange experiences. One elderly woman said she had noticed a tall figure standing across the street several nights in a row, unmoving, watching the house, disappearing before she could call anyone. Another resident swore they heard footsteps in their backyard at odd hours, though no one was ever found. Police combed through hours of surveillance footage from nearby stores and traffic lights, but something bizarre kept happening. Whenever the suspect might have appeared on camera, the footage glitched. Frames skipped, figures blurred into unrecognizable smears, as though the very image resisted being captured. Weeks passed, and suspicion fell on several people close to the victim. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives were interrogated. Secrets began surfacing, revealing hidden grudges, financial troubles, and long-buried conflicts. But every lead seemed to collapse into nothing. Alibis checked out, motives were plausible but not conclusive, and physical evidence pointed in conflicting directions. The case grew colder, but the town itself did not rest easy. Strange calls began flooding the local police line. Residents reported hearing screams at night coming from empty lots. Others claimed they saw fleeting shadows darting across windows when no one was inside. Children woke crying, telling their parents they saw someone standing at the foot of their bed, someone tall with eyes that seemed hollow. Detectives tried to dismiss these claims as fear spreading in a shaken community, but even they could not deny what was happening during interviews. On more than one occasion, while questioning potential witnesses, the lights in the room flickered violently, and audio recorders captured faint whispers that no one present had spoken. The words were never clear, but one phrase repeated often enough to be noticed: "You can't find me." In one of the most unsettling turns, the original 911 call from the neighbor was revisited. When replayed, investigators realized that beneath the frantic voice, another sound lingered faintly. A whisper, distorted, almost laughing. Yet when the audio was enhanced, the voice vanished, replaced by static, as though the tape itself refused to give away its secret. By now, the community was spiraling into paranoia. People locked their doors earlier, kept lights on through the night, and avoided walking alone. Yet the sense of being watched persisted. Some swore they saw a figure in reflective surfaces, in mirrors and dark windows, a presence that always seemed one step out of reach. Despite the chilling atmosphere, the police continued piecing together what they could. A breakthrough seemed near when a small, blood-stained note was discovered in the lining of the victim's coat. The handwriting was jagged, the ink smeared, but it carried a single sentence that unsettled everyone who read it. It said simply, "You will never understand." This note sparked endless theories. Some believed the killer was mocking investigators. Others thought it was the victim's desperate attempt to leave a clue. But the handwriting matched no one in their circle, not even remotely. Months turned into years, and the case officially remained unsolved. Yet the file stayed open on the desks of those who worked it, haunting them like an unfinished puzzle. Detectives admitted privately that they sometimes dreamed of the crime scene, waking drenched in sweat, certain they had seen the shadow of the killer standing in their own bedroom. Even today, the house on Willow Street remains empty. The curtains are drawn, the yard overgrown, the structure slowly decaying. People avoid walking past it, crossing to the other side of the road. Children dare each other to step onto the porch, but rarely make it past the first stair. Those who do swear they feel a crushing heaviness in their chest, as though the house itself rejects their presence. Local folklore has grown around the case, transforming the murder into something larger, something darker. They say the killer was never meant to be caught, that it was less a person and more a force, something that feeds on confusion and fear. Others insist the victim themselves was not innocent, that secrets buried in that house led to an ending too twisted for the living to fully grasp. Whatever the truth may be, the murder mystery remains unsolved, and perhaps that is the most terrifying part. Because in the silence of that house, in the flicker of those failing street lamps, and in the restless dreams of those who remember, something still lingers. Waiting, watching, daring anyone to try and unravel what cannot be explained. And each time the wind passes through the broken windows of Willow Street, carrying with it a low and hollow whistle, the town is reminded that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some truths are too twisted to face, and some killers may still be out there unseen, yet never gone. The cold case that still haunts the FBI. In the quiet hours of a foggy November morning, the FBI's field office in Richmond received an anonymous phone call. The voice on the other end was trembling, rushed, almost desperate to get words out before nerves took over. All they said was, "Check the woods near Meadowbrook Road, it's still there." Then the line went dead. No caller ID, no way to trace the source. Agents were dispatched, unsure if this was another cruel hoax or something far more sinister. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? By late afternoon, a team was combing through a dense patch of forest just outside of a rural neighborhood. The woods stretched for miles, silent except for the crunch of boots on damp leaves. The sky was gray, and the air carried that heavy stillness before nightfall. Just as some of the younger agents began to doubt the tip, one of them noticed something strange beneath a mound of half-frozen earth. A corner of what looked like an old tarp was sticking out. When they pulled it back, what they uncovered would become one of the FBI's most unsettling unsolved cases. The remains inside the tarp were badly decomposed, but clearly human. The body had been bound with rope that had frayed, but still held tight around the wrists and ankles. The jaw was broken, and the skull had a deep fracture that suggested a violent impact. But the most disturbing detail was carved into the wood of a nearby tree. Someone had etched a single word, uneven and jagged, as if done in haste or with shaking hands. The word was mine. From the beginning, the case spiraled into something that investigators could never fully control. Forensic experts determined the body had been there for years, maybe decades, but no missing persons report in the area matched the description. Clothing remnants found with the body seemed outdated, like something from the late 70s or early 80s, but without a label or traceable detail, it was almost impossible to place. Locals who lived near Meadowbrook Road had plenty to say when agents started asking questions. Some remembered strange lights in those woods at night. Others recalled hearing what they described as screams echoing through the trees, always around the same time, just past midnight. A retired hunter swore he once saw a figure crouched near that exact spot long before the discovery, but when he went closer, it vanished into the brush as if it had never been there. The FBI collected every scrap of evidence: soil samples, rope fibers, bone fragments, even the carving on the tree. They brought in behavioral profilers who suggested the killer had likely revisited the site more than once, maybe even for years. The word mine indicated possession, obsession, or perhaps a message meant to terrify anyone who stumbled upon it. And then came the tapes. 2 months into the investigation, a plain envelope arrived at the field office. No return address, no fingerprints. Inside was an old VHS tape. Agents set it up in a secure room, half expecting static or some meaningless footage. What they saw instead left even the most seasoned investigators silent. The tape showed a dimly lit basement. A single light bulb swung above, casting shadows that distorted every corner. In the center of the frame was a chair, old and wooden, with rope draped across its arms and legs. The camera zoomed in slowly, and though there was no sound, everyone watching could almost hear the creak of the wood and the hum of the bulb. Then, suddenly, the screen went black. A few seconds later, words appeared, written in block letters across the screen. "She's still waiting." No one could explain how the tape reached the FBI. Lab analysis showed it was recorded on equipment no longer common, perhaps decades old. The handwriting used in the message didn't match any samples in the Bureau's database. Still, the chilling phrase was undeniable. Whoever made it knew about the body in the woods. More envelopes arrived over the following years, each containing a tape or a photograph. One photo showed a stretch of the forest at night, with what looked like a figure standing far in the background, too blurred to identify. Another tape featured the same basement, but this time the chair was overturned and the ropes were scattered across the floor. Again, no sound. And again, a message appeared at the end: "You didn't listen." Agents began to lose sleep over the case. Some requested transfers, unable to shake the feeling that the person behind this was taunting them, watching them. There were whispers in the office about certain files going missing, about evidence being tampered with or moved without authorization. The word haunted wasn't just a metaphor anymore. Investigators felt they were being drawn into something they could never step back from. The case expanded into nearby states, with similar anonymous tips leading to dead ends or strange discoveries. In one abandoned farmhouse in Pennsylvania, agents found a wall covered in newspaper clippings about unsolved murders and disappearances, some dating back 50 years. In the center of the wall, circled in red, was a photo of the Meadowbrook Woods. Psychologists brought in by the Bureau suggested they were dealing with someone meticulous, someone who wanted control over the narrative of fear. The killer, if alive, was still out there. And if dead, his legacy was designed to linger, to keep the FBI chasing shadows indefinitely. But the most disturbing moment came when one of the tapes was played in slow motion. Buried in the background noise of the recording, beneath the static, a faint voice could be heard. The audio team enhanced it, and though it was muffled, the words were unmistakable. It was a woman's voice, whispering over and over, "Please, no more." The Bureau locked those tapes away, sealed in an evidence vault with restricted access. To this day, only a handful of people have seen them. The official files remain classified, but the story still circulates among agents late at night, when the halls of the office are quiet. Some claim the case was cursed from the start. Others believe it was never about solving a murder, but about becoming part of the game the killer designed. Every so often, even now, another envelope appears. No fingerprints, no DNA, no traceable marks. Sometimes it's a photograph of the forest. Sometimes it's a tape that refuses to play, filled with nothing but endless static. But each delivery always arrives with the same phrase scrawled across the package in black ink: mine. And that is why, among the countless unsolved cases in FBI archives, this one continues to linger. Not just because of what was found in the woods, but because of the sense that the case isn't truly over. That somewhere out there, the person responsible is still watching, still sending reminders, still pulling strings from the shadows. Even the agents who've retired, long since removed from the case, say they sometimes find things at their doorsteps. A small piece of rope, a torn scrap of tarp, a single photograph of trees in the dark. They know what it means. They don't talk about it publicly, but among themselves, they admit the same thing. This isn't just an unsolved murder. It's a haunting that refuses to fade. A cold case that doesn't just sit in the archives collecting dust, but one that continues to breathe, to follow, to remind. A cold case that still haunts the FBI. When a town woke up to a nightmare, it began on a quiet Sunday morning in a small town tucked between rolling hills and winding country roads. The air was still, the sky pale gray, and a light mist clung to the edges of the fields. Most people were still asleep, their windows dark, their houses silent. But by the time the sun rose higher, no one in that town would ever feel safe again. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came at dawn. A mail carrier driving along the main street noticed that nearly every door to the shops and houses stood wide open. At first, he thought maybe there had been a block party the night before, or that people were airing out their homes in the cool morning breeze. But then he realized the silence was unnatural. There were no footsteps on the sidewalks, no voices, no cars passing by. It felt like he was driving through a set of abandoned buildings rather than the heart of a living town. He parked his truck in front of the diner, a place that usually had the smell of bacon and coffee drifting out the door at that hour. The door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. Inside, plates of food sat untouched on tables, coffee still steaming in half-filled cups, chairs pushed back as if people had left in a hurry, but there was no one inside, not a single sound. By 7 in the morning, word spread quickly. Families waking up on the outskirts of town drove into the center, only to find the same thing: stores unlocked, lights buzzing overhead, radios playing faint static, but no people. The sheriff arrived shortly after, called by a dozen frantic phone calls, his cruiser pulling into the empty main street. He tried to stay calm, telling people it could be a power issue, a gas leak, maybe even a prank, but he couldn't explain the details: why purses, wallets, and shoes had been left behind, why hot food sat uneaten, why every clock seemed to have stopped at exactly 2:14 in the morning. At 8 a.m., the town was buzzing with confusion. Families gathered together, some crying, some refusing to step foot into the center. A few of the men decided to search the streets more thoroughly. They went into the barber shop, the pharmacy, the small movie theater. Everywhere they looked, the story was the same places, frozen in time, abandoned in the middle of the night, as if hundreds of people had simply stood up and walked away in unison. When they reached the church, they found the pews empty, but hymnals scattered across the floor. A single candle still burned at the altar, its wax pooled into a puddle, but no one was inside. Outside, the sheriff stood with his radio pressed to his mouth, calling the state police, but the line was filled with nothing but static. The phones inside the diner, the offices, even the switchboard at the town hall were all dead. The fear began to spread like wildfire. Mothers clutched their children, fathers paced the sidewalks, muttering under their breath. The sheriff finally ordered that no one go inside the town alone. Small groups began to search, some heading toward the school, others into the residential blocks. At 9:30, a group of 3 entered a row of houses along Pine Street. The first house was neat and tidy, the front door hanging open. Breakfast sat half-eaten on the table, the back door unlocked, but no one was there. The second house had the same eerie silence. But when they reached the third house, they found something that made one of the men scream so loudly it echoed down the street. On the living room floor was a deep black stain, as if the carpet had been burned or melted in a perfect circle. In the center of the circle, they found a child's toy, a wooden train, charred black as if it had been exposed to fire. Yet nothing else in the room was burned. The walls, the furniture, even the magazines on the coffee table were untouched. The men ran back outside, pale and shaking, telling everyone what they had seen. Panic broke out. Some people wanted to leave immediately, to drive as far as they could, but when they tried, they discovered something even worse. Every road leading out of the town was blocked. Not by cars, not by fallen trees, but by something they couldn't explain. At the edge of the asphalt, just where the town ended and the country roads began, there was nothing. No horizon, no fields, no sky, just a wall of gray mist stretching endlessly in every direction. Those who tried to drive through it never came back. The sound of their engines faded into the fog, and then silence. When others followed, walking to the edge, they swore they heard whispers in the mist, voices calling their names, but no one who entered returned. By noon, the town was unraveling. The sheriff tried to keep order, but people were breaking down, sobbing, screaming, praying. A group gathered in the town square, demanding answers, but there were none. The radios still played nothing but static, the clocks still frozen at 2:14, and the air felt heavier by the hour. Birds no longer sang, dogs no longer barked. The world outside the town seemed gone. That night, those who remained huddled together inside the high school gymnasium, pushing desks and chairs against the doors as if that would keep whatever was out there from coming in. The lights flickered, the air smelled faintly of smoke, and every so often, someone swore they heard footsteps echoing down the empty halls. At exactly 2:14 a.m., the lights went out. The gymnasium plunged into darkness. The screaming began almost instantly, people shouting for their children, stumbling in the dark. And then, over the chaos, came a sound no one could mistake. It was the toll of a church bell. Slow, deep, ringing through the night, though no one was left to ring it. When the lights finally flickered back on, several people were gone. Their sleeping bags still warm, their shoes still at their feet, but they were nowhere to be found. The sheriff's face turned pale as chalk. He could no longer offer explanations, no longer pretend this was something that could be solved. Whatever was happening was beyond reason. Over the next 2 nights, the pattern continued. At 2:14 a.m., the power died, the bell tolled, and more people vanished. Sometimes it was whole families, sometimes it was only one person lying between 2 others. No one heard a door open, no one saw a shadow move, they were simply gone. By the 4th day, only a handful of townspeople remained. They gathered in the diner, the same place where everything had started, too afraid to separate, too tired to keep fighting. The sheriff sat at the counter, his head in his hands, his badge glinting in the dim light. He told them all the same thing, that they should pray, that they should hold on to each other, and that whatever this was, it had already decided their fate. On the 5th morning, the sun rose to reveal a main street that was truly empty. The diner, the church, the school, every house, every street, all silent, all abandoned. Plates of food sat cold, doors hung open, radios still hummed with faint static, but no one was left. Not a single voice, not a single heartbeat. Weeks later, when state police finally arrived, they found a town frozen in time. They wrote reports, took photographs, sent samples to laboratories, but no explanation was ever found. The newspapers called it a mass disappearance, the strangest in the country's history. Some whispered it was government testing, others swore it was something supernatural, a curse, a punishment. But those who studied the files all noticed one detail that was never printed in the papers. Every clock in town had stopped at exactly 2:14 a.m. And every tape recorder, every answering machine, every piece of equipment that could capture sound had the same recording at that exact moment. A single toll of a church bell, followed by a whisper that no one could fully understand. Some thought it was saying, "Come home." Others swore it said, "You belong here." The truth has never been uncovered. The town still stands, its buildings rotting, its streets cracked with weeds. Travelers who pass by at night sometimes claim they hear the faint toll of a bell or see lights flicker in the windows of the diner, but no one dares to stop, no one dares to enter, because everyone knows what happened when that town woke up to a nightmare, and everyone fears that if they step inside, they might never leave. Unimaginable crimes buried in forgotten files. The courthouse basement smelled of dust and mold, a stale heaviness that seemed to cling to the walls, no matter how often the janitors sprayed disinfectant. It was a place no one wanted to linger in, with flickering fluorescent bulbs overhead and boxes stacked on metal shelves, each one labeled with fading marker, case numbers barely legible after years of neglect. Most of these files belonged to long-closed cases, matters that the system had stamped with finality. Yet, hidden among them were folders that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than simple legal disputes. Files that had been quietly pushed into the corners, cases that no one wanted to reopen, crimes so disturbing that people thought silence was safer than truth. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it there? On a stormy evening in late October, a clerk searching for property records stumbled on a set of boxes marked only with a red X. They were heavier than the others, filled with photographs, handwritten notes, and brittle police reports yellowed with time. She didn't know it then, but those boxes contained accounts of events that had never been explained, horrors that had been deliberately buried. These were not cases that appeared on the news anymore, if they ever truly did. They were crimes the town had agreed to forget, yet the details inside those folders painted a different picture. The first file contained reports from a small town in the Midwest, where in the early hours of a winter morning, a farmhouse was found completely abandoned. Breakfast had been set on the table, eggs half cooked on the stove, but no one was inside. The family of 5 was simply gone. Neighbors swore they had seen the father chopping wood the night before, his breath misting in the cold air. Yet, when investigators combed through the house, they discovered something that still defies explanation. Every clock in the home had stopped at the same moment. Each watch, each wall clock, even the small wristwatch tucked in a dresser drawer, all frozen at exactly 2:17 a.m. No bodies were ever recovered, no evidence of forced entry, no tracks in the snow, just silence and the eerie stillness of a house caught in time. The file included black and white photographs of the kitchen, of the empty beds where the children should have been sleeping, of muddy footprints leading from the back door to the edge of the woods before abruptly vanishing. Officers wrote in their notes that the woods had been searched for days, dogs had been brought in, but the trail ended in nothing. The case was eventually closed with no resolution, the family listed as missing, presumed dead. But what chilled the clerk reading those reports wasn't the official conclusion. It was a single page tucked between the evidence logs, a handwritten statement from a deputy who had since retired. He wrote that during the search, he heard children's laughter echoing through the forest, even though no one was there. Another box held records from a coastal town in Maine. A fishing vessel had washed ashore without a crew. The boat was still running, lights glowing faintly in the fog, nets half pulled in, but not a single person was found on board. The captain, 2 deckhands, even the dog that usually accompanied them, gone. What was strange, investigators noted, was that all of their personal belongings remained untouched. Wallets, cigarettes, even half-eaten sandwiches were left in place as if the men had simply vanished mid-task. Blood samples were collected from the deck, smeared along the railing, though no one could determine whose blood it was. The most disturbing piece in that file was a photograph of the captain's logbook. The last entry read, "The sea is singing tonight, and we are not alone." The handwriting became erratic, ink smudged by what looked like water, before the words trailed off into illegible scrawls. The Coast Guard searched for weeks, dragging the waters, but not a single body was ever recovered. Families demanded answers, officials offered theories of mutiny or drowning, but no evidence supported any explanation. Eventually, the file was marked closed, unsolved, and placed in the forgotten pile. The deeper the clerk dug into those boxes, the darker the stories became. One folder described a roadside motel in Nevada where several travelers had checked in on different nights, none of whom ever checked out. Cars were left in the parking lot, luggage neatly stacked in the rooms, but the guests themselves disappeared without a trace. Housekeepers swore they felt watched while cleaning those rooms, and some refused to enter them alone. Local deputies searched the property, pulled up carpet, even dismantled floorboards, yet they found nothing. Still, the disappearances continued until the motel abruptly shut down, its owner leaving town overnight. Rumor had it that some of the rooms were sealed off, padlocked from the outside, but when the building was eventually demolished years later, no one spoke about what might have been discovered inside. One of the most unsettling files contained a series of crime scene photographs from a small community outside New Orleans. They showed a single street where, one by one, entire households had been found dead, yet not a single wound was visible on any of the victims. Men, women, children, even pets, lifeless but without explanation. Autopsies revealed no poison, no signs of struggle, no cause of death at all. Their expressions, however, were what haunted the investigators. Each face was frozen in terror, eyes wide, mouths open, as if they had seen something so horrifying it stopped their hearts instantly. The reports ended abruptly, with no official conclusion. But at the bottom of the folder, someone had scrawled a note on the back of an evidence tag. It read, "Do not reopen. Some truths are not meant to be known." As the storm raged outside the courthouse, the clerk flipped through more files. She found witness accounts of lights in the sky above remote farmland, photographs of symbols carved into trees deep in Appalachian woods, coroner's reports from bodies found miles away from where they had disappeared, untouched by animals, preserved as if time itself had stopped around them. Every story had been silenced. Reporters were warned off, families told to stop asking questions, and communities left to quietly heal without answers. Yet reading through the notes, it was clear the investigators themselves had been shaken, writing words like unexplainable, unnatural, and beyond comprehension. The last box was the heaviest. Inside were recordings, old cassette tapes from interviews. One tape had no label, only a scratch across its plastic surface. Curious, the clerk played it in an old machine she found in the office. The recording was faint, voices distorted, but she could make out the sound of someone breathing heavily, followed by a man whispering, "It's here with us." It never left. Then came a scream, high-pitched and sudden, before the tape cut off into static. She slammed the stop button, her hands trembling. The fluorescent lights above buzzed louder than before, or maybe it was just her own pulse in her ears. She wanted to leave, to run upstairs into the safety of the night watchman's presence, but part of her couldn't stop reading. She flipped through the last set of documents, which contained lists of names, all typed neatly in columns. At the bottom of each list was the same note: file closed, evidence destroyed. Except the evidence wasn't destroyed. It had been hidden down here, waiting to be found again. And as she stood in that basement, thunder rolling outside and rain lashing against the small windows, she realized something that chilled her to her core. Some of the most recent files weren't old at all. They were dated within the last decade, and the names on the missing persons lists included people she recognized, neighbors, coworkers, even a distant cousin whose disappearance had never been explained. Her breath caught as she noticed a fresh folder sitting at the top of one pile. The paper still crisp, the ink dark. On the cover was her own town's name. She hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper with a heading she had seen too many times that night. It read, "Unimaginable crimes. Status, buried." The room felt colder, the shadows seemed to stretch longer. She shut the folder, shoved it back into the box, and stumbled toward the stairwell. But as she reached for the light switch, she froze. The basement door above her was closed. She hadn't heard it shut. And from the far corner of the basement, where the shelves disappeared into darkness, came the faint sound of children laughing. She ran, heart pounding, refusing to look back, refusing to listen. The boxes remained where they had been, buried in forgotten files, their secrets intact. Yet those who had read them could never truly walk away. Because once you opened the door to those crimes, once you saw what the world had tried to erase, you understood the terrible truth. Some crimes are too dark to be solved, some horrors are never meant to see daylight, and some files are buried not because they were forgotten, but because remembering them would destroy everything we believe about safety, about justice, about reality itself. A trail of evidence that led to nowhere. It began on a chilly evening in the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania, the kind of evening where the air carried the scent of damp earth and the fog rolled low, hugging the ground like a shroud. A call came into the local sheriff's office just after sunset. A driver reported an abandoned pickup truck parked at an odd angle along a narrow country road. Its headlights were still on, casting pale beams into the trees. The engine had long gone cold, but the driver's side door was ajar. Deputies arrived quickly, their flashlights cutting through the mist. They found the truck exactly as reported. Inside were scattered belongings, a jacket, a half-empty thermos, a pair of work gloves, and on the passenger seat, a wallet with identification still inside. The keys dangled in the ignition, but the owner was nowhere to be seen. The search began that night. Locals, officers, and volunteers combed through the surrounding woods with lanterns, dogs, and voices echoing into the dark. For hours they called his name, their shouts swallowed by the thick forest. The only sounds that answered were the rustling leaves and the occasional distant cry of an owl. By midnight, nothing was found. The following morning, investigators returned. That's when they noticed something unusual. Just beyond the ditch, beside the road, pressed into the damp soil, were footprints. They led from the driver's side door into the trees. The prints were clear, steady at first, as though the person had walked calmly. The trail seemed straightforward, like it would lead to answers. But as the deputies followed, the tracks grew strange. A few yards into the woods, the prints changed direction suddenly, curving sharply to the left, deeper into the forest. Then they doubled back, overlapping on themselves. Investigators described it as though someone had been pacing or circling or perhaps lost. The ground was soft enough that impressions were easy to read, but after about 50 feet, the tracks stopped. Just stopped. No broken branches beyond that point. No drag marks. No further trail. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. Detectives brought in tracking dogs. The animals picked up the scent near the truck, followed the same path into the woods, and then, just like the footprints, halted abruptly. The dogs whined, circled, confused, but couldn't push the trail any farther. It was as if the scent itself had dissolved. The case quickly drew attention. Reporters arrived, their vans parked on the roadside, cameras aimed at deputies pushing deeper into the trees. Families from nearby towns came to watch. Some offered help, others whispered about local legends. That forest, they said, had always carried a reputation. Strange lights had been spotted there at night, hunters had told stories of hearing voices when no one else was around, and decades earlier, an entire hunting cabin had burned down with no known cause. Days passed, and still no sign of the missing man. Then a clue appeared. About half a mile from where the footprints ended, a hiker stumbled upon something tangled in a bramble, a torn piece of fabric. Investigators matched it to the shirt the man had been wearing when last seen. It was weather-stained, ripped as though snagged in the brush, but there was no blood, no evidence of a struggle, just cloth, caught on thorns. Another search was launched from that spot. Volunteers lined shoulder to shoulder, sweeping the woods. They found more oddities. A boot print, deep in the mud, but only one, not a pair. A cigarette lighter sitting neatly on a moss-covered log, though the man wasn't known to smoke. And strangest of all, a small trail of coins, scattered in a line through the leaves. Quarters, dimes, pennies, each one spaced a few feet apart, leading nowhere. Investigators picked them up carefully, bagged them, but they provided no answers. At night, search teams swore they heard things. A deputy later admitted he felt watched while combing the woods, as though eyes tracked him between the trees. One volunteer quit after only an hour, shaken, saying he'd heard a low humming sound that moved around him in the dark. Another claimed to have seen a faint light flicker between the trunks, like a lantern swaying, but when he ran toward it, nothing was there. The trail of evidence became more baffling with each discovery. Items appeared that belonged to the missing man, but scattered across strange distances. His other boot was found days later, sitting upright on a stone, his watch, still ticking, turned up near the banks of a shallow creek. But no body, no clear struggle, no explanation of how the man had moved or been moved through the forest. Some officers believed foul play was involved, though no suspects were ever identified. Others whispered about something less explainable. The townsfolk leaned heavily into superstition, murmuring about the woods being cursed. Months dragged on. Evidence piled up, but always led to another dead end. Each clue raised more questions. How did his belongings keep appearing in places search teams had already covered? Why did the footprints and scent stop so abruptly? Who or what was moving through the trees at night when officers swore they heard voices just out of reach? Eventually, the official search was scaled back, reporters left, the crowds disappeared, and the case grew cold. The family clung to hope, but no remains were ever found. All that was left was a file thick with reports, photographs of scattered belongings, and testimony from those who swore something unnatural lingered in those woods. To this day, locals still talk about the case. They say on foggy nights, if you walk near that stretch of road, you can see the faint glow of headlights still shining in the trees. Some claim they've heard footsteps crunching behind them, only to turn and find nothing there. Others insist the man's spirit is still wandering, forever trapped on a trail that leads nowhere. What's certain is that the trail of evidence, the footprints, the coins, the torn fabric, the belongings never gave investigators closure. It all led deeper and deeper into mystery, until it ended in silence. Unsolved crimes hidden in plain sight.t. The night was colder than usual when the first reports came in. In a small town surrounded by miles of farmland and quiet back roads, the local police received a call just after midnight. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, almost frantic. A man had been seen standing under a flickering streetlight on Ashwood Lane, not moving, not speaking, just staring. The caller thought he was drunk at first, but then realized something was deeply wrong. The figure wasn't swaying or shivering in the chill. He was perfectly still, like a statue, his face lost in the shadows. When officers finally arrived, minutes later, the man was gone, leaving only a pair of muddy footprints pressed into the damp pavement. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? At the time, it didn't seem like much, just another strange incident in a town that rarely made headlines. But within weeks, more calls followed. A woman driving home late saw a figure crouched near the old railway bridge, holding what looked like a torn piece of clothing. When she slowed down to look closer, the figure stepped back into the darkness, vanishing almost instantly. She swore she had seen blood on his hands. Others began reporting bizarre encounters, fleeting glimpses of someone standing in places no one should be at those hours. Near the school playground at night, in the overgrown cemetery by the church, in the windows of houses that had been abandoned for years, always watching, always silent. The unease spread quietly through town. People avoided walking after dark, doors were locked earlier than usual, and whispers carried in hushed tones about someone out there who didn't belong. Yet no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. One morning, a local farmer named Thomas failed to return from his routine before dawn chores. His wife went looking for him near the barn and found the doors ajar, a lantern still burning faintly inside. But Thomas was nowhere. His boots were left in the dirt as if he had stepped out of them. His coat hung neatly on a nail, untouched. Search parties combed the fields, calling his name until sunrise painted the horizon, but there was no sign of him. Days later, the sheriff's department received a brown envelope slipped under their office door. Inside was a photograph, grainy and dark. It showed Thomas standing under that same streetlight on Ashwood Lane, staring into the camera with lifeless eyes. Behind him, barely visible, was a figure in the shadows, taller than him, with its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The envelope had no return address, no fingerprints, nothing. That photograph marked the beginning of what locals would later call the season of fear. Not long after Thomas vanished, a young couple driving home from a late-night movie reported seeing someone lying on the side of Miller Road. They pulled over, thinking it was a person in need of help, but as soon as they stepped out, the figure bolted into the woods. The man gave chase for a few steps before stopping. Because the fleeing figure didn't run like a person, it moved in jerks and lurches, arms hanging at strange angles, its head snapping from side to side as if it were searching in the dark. The couple drove straight to the sheriff's office, their voices trembling as they tried to explain what they saw. Then came the second disappearance. A school teacher named Linda failed to show up for class one morning. When officers checked her home, they found the front door unlocked and her car still parked in the driveway. Inside, everything seemed in place, except for a trail of wet footprints leading from the back door to the kitchen table. On the table lay another photograph, this time showing Linda sitting inside her car with someone standing behind her, their face obscured by a hood, one hand resting on her shoulder. The photo looked recent, taken perhaps the night before. But Linda was gone, and she would never be seen again. By then, fear had reached a boiling point. Parents refused to let their children play outside. Night patrols doubled, yet they caught nothing. People swore they saw someone lurking, yet whenever police responded, there was no trace left behind. More photographs began arriving. Each one slipped quietly under the sheriff's office door, each one showing the missing person in an eerie pose, always with that shadowy figure lurking close by. No one could figure out who was taking the photos or how they were being delivered without anyone seeing. The strangest part was how public it all seemed. These crimes were not hidden in distant woods or secret basements. They were unfolding right in the heart of the community, in plain sight, yet no one could stop them. Weeks stretched into months. Fear became a way of life. People began boarding up their windows, selling their homes, leaving town altogether. The main street grew quieter, businesses closed earlier, and whispers about curses and old legends spread like wildfire. Some claimed the town was built over unmarked graves. Others swore it was the work of a cult operating in the open, using fear to control everyone. But no explanation ever satisfied the dread that lingered. One late evening, just before winter, a group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night near the abandoned church at the edge of town, a place where several sightings had been reported. They brought flashlights and snacks, laughing nervously as they tried to act brave. But by midnight, laughter had turned to silence. They noticed movement inside the church through the broken stained glass windows, a figure pacing slowly up and down the aisle. When one of them shone a flashlight toward the doorway, the beam caught something horrifying. Dozens of photographs, just like the ones the sheriff had received, were taped along the inside walls of the church. Faces of the missing stared back at them, each photo showing the same shadowy figure lingering close behind. The teens fled in terror, but not all of them made it home. By morning, one of them was missing, leaving only his flashlight at the church's entrance, still glowing weakly against the cold stone steps. Another envelope appeared at the sheriff's office the following day. Inside was a photo of the boy standing in the church doorway. Behind him, the same towering shadow, head tilted to the side, staring into the camera. The sheriff, exhausted and overwhelmed, admitted he could no longer protect the town. Investigators from the outside came in, studied the photographs, interviewed witnesses, searched every corner. Yet nothing ever tied together. No fingerprints, no signs of forced entry, no fibers or DNA. The figure that everyone saw always remained just out of reach, always disappearing the moment you tried to focus on it. In time, the disappearances slowed, but the fear never left. The town became hollow, many families abandoning their homes. The church was sealed, the roads grew empty, and even now, those who live nearby refuse to speak of what happened. They say if you drive down Ashwood Lane late at night, you might see someone standing perfectly still under the streetlight, staring without blinking, waiting. And if you stop to look too long, you might find an envelope on your doorstep the very next morning holding a photograph of yourself with that same figure standing right behind you. To this day, the crimes remain unsolved, the photographs remain locked away in evidence files, and the figure that haunted the town has never been identified. It all happened in plain sight in front of neighbors, friends, and family, yet no one was able to stop it. And perhaps that is the most terrifying part, that the truth was never hiding. It was standing right there, watching as people vanished one by one into the darkness. The town that hid its darkest secret. The road into the small town was always quiet at night, a narrow strip of cracked asphalt cutting through endless fields of corn that swayed beneath the pale glow of the moon. Travelers who passed by would often remark how the place seemed frozen in time, as though the decades had moved on everywhere else but here. The welcome sign, chipped and leaning slightly to the right, greeted visitors with fading letters declaring the name of the town proudly, though few outsiders ever stopped long enough to remember it. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? It was just past midnight when the first unsettling incident began. A thin mist rolled in from the nearby river, curling low against the ground and weaving between the wooden houses that lined the main street. Most of the town was asleep, curtains drawn tight, doors locked, as though the residents all shared the same unspoken understanding that nothing good ever happened after dark. On the far edge of town, a lone diner sat glowing beneath buzzing neon lights. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food. A handful of locals sat scattered across the booths, their conversations hushed, eyes occasionally drifting toward the wide windows that looked out into the night. The bell above the door rang, and for a moment, the entire diner fell silent. A man stepped in, his face pale and clothes damp, as though he had walked straight through the mist itself. Without speaking, he slid into a booth near the back, his trembling hands clasped around a worn leather bag. The waitress, a middle-aged woman who had worked there her whole life, poured him coffee without asking. She glanced down at the bag, then back at his face, and for the briefest moment, her expression hardened, as if she recognized something no one else could. She leaned close, whispering words too low for anyone else to hear, and the man nodded slowly. Whatever passed between them left the other customers uneasy. They pretended to focus on their meals, but the tension in the room was undeniable. At 3 a.m, the church bell rang once, though no one had pulled the rope. The sound carried across the town, deep and hollow, waking those who had been resting fitfully in their beds. Curtains were parted, lights flicked on, and whispers spread through the night air like sparks in dry grass. The bell was never supposed to ring at that hour, not since the tragedy that had taken place long ago. People knew it, and yet no one dared step outside to check. By dawn, the mist had lifted, but unease clung to the town like a shadow. Children walked to school with their parents close by, every set of eyes watching the empty church tower at the center of town. The man from the diner was nowhere to be found. The booth he had sat in was empty, though the waitress swore she had watched him walk toward the back door before the bell had rung. His coffee cup remained on the table, the liquid inside, now stone cold, but the bag was gone. For days, whispers filled the town. Some said the man had been part of the old families, the ones who had lived here since the town's founding, before records were kept properly. Others swore he carried evidence of what had really happened during the fire that destroyed half the town square decades ago. The fire had always been explained as an accident, but deep down, many suspected there was more to it. The town rebuilt quickly, too quickly, and certain names disappeared from records, erased as if they had never existed. On the third night, more strange events began. Lights flickered in homes closest to the church. A dog howled relentlessly at shadows that no one else could see. In the cemetery behind the churchyard, fresh soil was found disturbed, though no burials had been scheduled. The caretaker insisted nothing had been touched, but his voice shook as he said it. By the end of the week, fear had settled in the bones of the townsfolk. The local sheriff tried to calm people down, holding a meeting in the old hall near the river. Lanterns cast long, flickering shadows on the walls as neighbors gathered, their voices rising with anger and fear. Some demanded answers about the bell, others accused each other of hiding the truth. The sheriff raised his hand for silence, and when the room finally grew quiet, he told them flatly that there were things in this town better left buried. His words hung in the air like a curse. But the younger ones weren't satisfied. A group of curious residents decided they had to see for themselves what the church was hiding. That night, under a cloudy sky that threatened rain, they crept into the churchyard with flashlights and nervous laughter that faded quickly into silence. The heavy wooden doors of the church groaned as they pushed them open, the stale smell of dust and mildew washing over them. Inside, the pews were covered in sheet. The school with a disturbing secret. There's an old brick school on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania, a place where the walls seem to hold their breath and the windows watch you as you pass. For decades, it stood in silence, abandoned, its playground rusting away while weeds crawled up the fence line. Locals whispered about it, claiming the school was closed down for reasons no one could quite agree on. Some said it was funding, others said it was structural decay, but underneath those explanations, hidden in the way people's voices dropped when they mentioned it, was the suggestion that the school was hiding something darker. It always began the same way, with an odd stillness whenever someone walked past at night. No traffic, no crickets, no wind against the trees. Just the building looming in silence, as though it had been listening for you all along. Years ago, the town's police chief had to respond to a call about trespassers breaking in, teenagers daring each other to stay overnight. Most of them never made it past the gymnasium before bolting out in a panic, screaming about voices that weren't there. But one time, a group had gone further. They explored the long corridors, their flashlights bouncing against peeling paint and lockers dented from years of use. On the second floor, they found an entire row of classrooms where desks had been overturned and chalkboards were covered in words that didn't belong there. No one admitted to writing them, but the words were carved in deep, jagged scratches. Don't let them out. By the time the chief arrived that night, the kids were hysterical. One of them was missing a shoe, and all of them swore they heard footsteps following them, even though the officers found no sign of anyone else inside. The kids were released to their parents with warnings, but the incident brought back the town's unease. If you ask the older residents, they'll tell you the school shut down after a string of strange events. Students had gone missing. Not all at once, and not in numbers large enough to make national headlines, but one by one, quietly, over the course of a year. A boy vanished after staying late for detention. A girl never came home after drama practice. Each time there were searches, dogs combing the woods, helicopters buzzing overhead, and yet nothing, not a trace. The most disturbing case happened late in autumn, when the days grew shorter and the nights felt heavier. A teacher had stayed late to grade papers, and according to her own testimony, she heard footsteps in the hallway long after everyone else had left. She called out, expecting it to be a student or janitor, but there was no response. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside her classroom door. She pulled it open, but the hallway was empty. Only the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She left in a hurry that night, but when she returned the next morning, something had changed. Her desk had been moved. Not just a little, it had been dragged to the opposite side of the room, scraping deep grooves into the tile. On top of it, her graded papers were stacked neatly, but every page had been torn in half and placed back together in the shape of a cross. From that point on, teachers began requesting transfers. Some quit outright, unable to explain what they had seen or heard. The janitor, a man who had worked there for years, finally resigned after finding something in the basement. He never gave details, but when pressed, he muttered only one sentence before leaving town for good. They shouldn't have dug it up. The basement itself was unusual. Unlike most schools, this one had a sub-basement, a level not listed on any of the building's official blueprints. It was accessed through a heavy metal door at the end of a utility corridor. Teachers claimed it was used for storage, but former staff members later admitted they had never been allowed down there. Only the principal had the key, and when the school was shut down, that door was welded shut. One winter evening, years after its closure, a pair of urban explorers managed to cut their way inside. They filmed their exploration, posting shaky footage online that circulated briefly before being taken down. In the video, you can hear them laughing nervously as they descend the stairs. The deeper they go, the colder the air becomes, their breath visible even with their flashlights trembling. Then the laughter stops. The camera catches walls lined with strange markings, symbols carved into the concrete, some smeared with what looked like dried rust. The explorers whisper about hearing voices. One of them says he feels like someone is breathing on the back of his neck. The video ends abruptly, with the sound of metal slamming shut and their panicked screams. Neither of those men was ever identified, and the footage was dismissed as a hoax by skeptics. But those who saw it said the fear in their voices was real. The town eventually fenced off the property, posting signs that warned trespassers of prosecution, but that never stopped the rumors. Some say at night, if you stand near the chain-link fence, you can hear the sound of children reciting lessons in unison, though no one has set foot in those classrooms in decades. Others claim they've seen lights moving across the second-floor windows, even though the building has no electricity. One night, a local man walking his dog swore he saw someone standing at the entrance, staring at him. When he shouted, the figure didn't move, only turned its head slightly, as though listening. The man fled, dragging his dog behind him, and when he glanced back, the figure was gone. The police no longer respond to calls about the school. It's considered a nuisance property, a place where legends thrive, but evidence is scarce. Still, the silence surrounding the building is unnerving. Whenever construction crews attempt to tear it down, something happens, a machine malfunctions, a worker is injured, or blueprints go missing. Eventually, contractors refuse to take the job. The school remains untouched, its secrets sealed inside. What makes it all the more chilling is that some residents claim to remember the missing children differently. Ask around long enough, and you'll hear conflicting accounts. Some insist there were 5, others swear it was 7. One elderly man, shaking as he spoke, said there were never missing children at all. That the town invented those stories to cover up what really happened beneath the school. But when pressed on what that was, he refused to continue, muttering that some things are better left buried. Now, the building stands like a scar on the town's landscape. During the day, it's just another ruin, a relic of forgotten times. But at night, when fog rolls in and the streetlights flicker, the school seems alive, waiting. The air grows heavy, and the silence presses in on anyone who dares to linger too long. People hurry past without looking up, afraid they'll catch a glimpse of a face peering out from a window. And though the official record states that the school was closed for budget reasons, the townspeople know better. They may never admit it openly, but deep down, they all feel it. That building is not empty. It's holding something that has been waiting for years, something that should never be let out.